welcome to Rants and Raves video edition. It is a very chilly minus 27 degrees morning outside there. My house is nice and wrapped up. I've done everything but wrap it in a plastic bag, and I find to my distress that I am out of coffee. So, at any rate, while I was preparing some other presentations to come in the future, wait with bated breath, I found an old piece of mine. How old? 2006 it was. It was not long after I'd returned from living in Eastern Europe for more than a decade, for more than 13 years. At any rate, and it was on the subject of young radicals. Now, we seem to have a lot of them around today, and I looked at this thing to see, okay, how well does it wear after 13 years? And so, well, it wears pretty good, I think. So what I had written about at that time was that there seemed to be certain defining traits of young radicals. Now, by young radicals, I mean people across the political spectrum, because as I was writing it, I found to my discomfort that it applied to a lot of my fellow libertarians as well. Yeah, well, as Eric Hoffer pointed out in The True Believer, and published in the year of my birth, in fact, that radicals, true believers of all stripes, have certain things in common that transcend the specific ideology. This made an awful lot of people uncomfortable when he pointed this out, that in fact, the religious fanatics have a great deal in common with, for example, communists, Nazis, etc. Now, Hoffer didn't condemn such across the board. He pointed out, or hinted actually, he didn't. It was one part of his thesis that he didn't really go into very deeply, but that fanaticism is sometimes the only thing that can oppose fanaticism. But at any rate, these are traits of a certain type of personality I call the achingly earnest young radical, or airhead for short. Accordingly, this episode is Airheads Revisited. And before I go on, I would like to make something rather plain here. I am not being holier than thou. I was that achingly earnest young radical in my youth, and the fact that I have an unusually detailed memory brings back examples of this which can be embarrassingly painfully embarrassing. Okay, now the characteristics that I noted are in order. 1. The enemy of a bad guy is a good guy. 2. Oppression, discrimination, and tyranny make you noble. 3. Xenophilia. It's better somewhere else. 4. It is a betrayal of the truth to fail to state it in the most, offensive way possible. 5. Custom, traditions, and manners are just rules and regulations in disguise. 6. Anything less than moral perfection is evil. 7. Meliorism, and I've written about this at length elsewhere, but all problems have solutions. All the situations can be improved. Number 8. A heterodox theory of history or society is automatically better than an orthodox one. 9. Nihilism. The existing state of affairs is so awful that it must be destroyed so a new one can be built over de novo. And 10. Disagreement comes from villainous and self-interested motives. 9 and 10 is where it gets pathological, but I'd like to go down these with you. The enemy of a bad guy is a good guy. This stems from an inability to deal with ambiguity. If there's somebody they don't like that is imperfect, imperfectly good, or a mixed bag of characteristics, then the guy who opposes him must be, the knight in shining armor. They must be. The the communists for the last over the last century used this quite a lot. It's we're fighting fascism, therefore we're the good guys. Yeah, yes. American propaganda during the World War II relied on this knee-jerk reaction. Stalin is fighting Hitler, therefore Stalin is kindly Uncle Joe. Well, we'll overlook the fact that he murdered at least 10 times as many people as Hitler did. You know, we had to make a bargain with the devil, and it was very, very distasteful, but we had to do it to save Western civilization. We did inherit a lot of problems afterwards, and, but okay. Oppression, discrimination, and tyranny make you noble. That's number 2. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. It would seem like anybody who had ever noticed something that prolonged oppression and discrimination and being treated as inferior tend to make you a scumbag. They tend to give you personality, culturally induced personality traits that are pretty damned unattractive. As my friend Mark McYoung likes to say, it's the skills that you need to survive in poverty are not the skills you need to escape it. We had this discussion a long time. Very often people in poverty are people who come from what we call honor cultures as opposed to dignity cultures, and I dealt with this in another of my episodes here. But Bertrand Russell noticed this a very long time ago in an essay called The Superior Virtue of the Oppressed. Again, long-term oppression tends to make you a scumbag. Sorry. If you have to scrabble hard for your existence, well, sometimes you have to scrabble hard, and those that have to fight hard very often are not nice people. And 3, xenophilia. It's better somewhere else. Well, back in my youth, there were still people around. It was the tail end of this. This began to, as members of the Communist Party USA began to drop away after things like the Hungarian uprising, the revelations in when Khrushchev's secret speech about Stalin's crimes was finally published and such. But the diehards then picked on China, because nobody had ever been there. China is the earthly paradise. China was doing all these really cool things and everything like that. Well, didn't we all get those of us that recognize this got a little bit of a warm, fuzzy feeling when we saw Richard Godawful Nixon went to China, and he and the luminaries of Beijing were toasting each other with martinis. Martinis, the symbol of ruling class depression. There was a brief attempt to locate the home of true socialism in Bulgaria, I think, and people were looking at the Bulgarian franchise. Then, as radicalism got less radical, and said, oh, we're socialists, not communists. Then it was Europe, the social welfare states of Scandinavia and such. And what the heck, Sweden is a very nice place if you don't go into certain neighborhoods in Stockholm or Malmo. But and there were socialist parties in there was a brief. There was a brief flirtation. Some libertarians had a brief flirtation with Switzerland, I think, there, which is also a very nice place, I think. But the Swiss maybe had a bit too much of a hard-headed attitude of, if you're here, you're not Swiss, and you're not working, you can't stay. And open borders fanatics are kind of discomforted by that. And the corollary of this is, it's worse here than somewhere else, and which you can only go, okay, so why aren't you there? For it is a betrayal of the truth to state it in anything but the most offensive way possible. As Robert Heinlein once posed a question, would you rather have a nice, thick, juicy steak, or would you rather have a segment of muscle tissue from the immature corpse of a castrated bull? Well, a young radical of the Vietnam War era and veteran of the anti-war movement who bears an uncomfortable relationship to myself once said said that the draft is slavery, and that people who work in selective service officers are on the same moral level of blackbirders off the Ivory Coast, slave traders, and one day would hang from the lampposts of their respective cities. Now, it's not that I believe any differently these days. It's that I've learned that imprecations, threats, insults, and all very, very rarely convince people. If you want someone to change their mind, you should, consider being polite to begin with. A real good example on the libertarian side of this was Murray Rothbard when speaking for the perfectly defensible position of having adoptions for fees. I mean, say, you want a kid? Why don't you pay? Pay for it. Why don't you make sure that maybe the child's mother gets some of the exorbitant amount of money that you have to pay to adopt these days. Now, the counter was, you're talking about selling babies. Now, instead of, going like, listen, wouldn't it be better if the mother got some of this money? I mean, usually these are mothers in desperate straits who can't keep a child. And wouldn't she, wouldn't you want to do this if you were trying to take a child into a loving home and you've just proved you're affluent by the fact that you can afford this? And Murray Rothbard instead went, yeah, selling babies, let's have a free market in selling babies. Oh, Murray, he did that a lot. Ayn Rand did that. Instead of, she said, she wrote a book, a collection of essays actually by her and other people called The Virtue of Selfishness. And in part what she was doing was taking a word with an established meaning and doing so, and using it in a very unusual way, using it in a way that's not common to get people think. It's also possible she was just being an ass, but instead of saying something like, after all, what do we mean by selfish? Do we mean enlightened self-interest? And after all, didn't Rabbi Hillel say, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And instead she went, selfishness, selfish is good, which Gordon Gekko, Michael Douglas in the movie Wall Street later adapted, greed is good. Again. All right. 5, and this was an observation I actually picked up from Vine Deloria Jr., the American Indian author and anthropologist, who observed that the reason the hippies did not become a real legitimate culture was they failed to see custom, traditions, and manners as anything but rules and regulations in disguise. Now, a fellow named Albert J. Nock, a long time ago, wrote a book called Our Enemy the State, in which he defined two types of power. He said there's social power and government power. Social power, customs, rules, traditions, and manners, and such. The power of social approval or disapproval, and government power, which is law, which is do this, don't do this, or we'll fine you, imprison you, or kill you. Remember, the ultimate sanction of every law is death. So, P.G. O'Rourke wrote a wonderful essay called Would You Shoot Your Grandmother to Pay I-95, making that very point. He's probably familiar with Nock too, but what I noted was in the post-communist countries of Eastern Europe were discovering very painfully that it is difficult to write a constitution for a free country without long tradition of local institutions to base it on. And that countries like Poland, the countries that were recovering the quickest, were precisely those which had continuous intact cultural traditions. Now, when I was in Bulgaria, I noticed something, and I put it to my classes there. That I said, I had noticed there is no native Bulgarian high culture, and in another place I will discourse on what I mean by high culture. But I said Bulgaria was subjugated by the Ottoman Empire for a very long time, and for centuries the highest that a Bulgarian could rise without converting to Islam or something was maybe village hetman or something of that sort. But the royal palace of Bulgaria, when they got a country back, was formerly a stable. What there is of native Bulgarian literature was preserved in monasteries for centuries, and only emerged in the 19th century as an exile literature published in Romania and Russia. Now, I said what is distinctly Bulgarian about their culture, which, by the way, rather looks Turkish, but don't tell them that. What remains of distinctly Bulgarian culture is basically a village peasant culture, which urban intellectuals feel very, very little connection to. Now, I brought this up in my classes, and though this is a small sample, the agreement was 100%. And one young lady made a remark which has haunted me ever since, which was, she said, "Sometimes I think we will have to develop an aristocracy before we can have a democracy." And I was about to, wait a minute, and then I remembered that the democracy in America that we are so proud of was founded by Massachusetts plutocrats and Virginia slave owners, as some people go on ad nauseum about, which leads to number 6. Anything less than moral perfection is evil. This has been a feature of young radicalism, airheadism in our country for a while now. Our country was fatally flawed at the beginning, therefore it cannot possibly have produced anything of any value, is utterly corrupt and evil and needs to be destroyed, and we should give North America back to the Indians. What we're supposed to do with the descendants of slaves, well, I don't know, reparations. Green tea. This will no doubt extend my life so I can freeze to death. Now, the corollary to this is dealing with anything less than perfect constitutes compromising with evil. Oh, ouch. Yes, I used to be like this. This is, for example, among libertarians, there was a libertarian organization whose motto was, "We don't compromise." Libertarians have a problem with this. For example, David Brin used the example of, said, "Yes, I believe in decriminalization of recreational drugs, but whenever I bring up that, why don't we do this gradually? Why don't we start with pot, and then with the serious drugs, some of the more serious stuff," and said there's an argument for decriminalization. We can mete it out to them in pure known dosage of known purity, of guaranteed purity and such. Could we do it, say, start doing it gradually? Could we experiment with this to see if we're really on the right track? Could we do it by doctor's prescription? Could we have registered addicts? Something like that. No, it's all gotta go right away. It's boom. Okay. So when I hear somebody say, "We don't compromise with evil," or "we don't compromise," nowadays what I hear is, "Nobody's opinion but mine matters." Hey. 7. Meliorism. All problems have solutions. All situations can be improved. This is an original observation of mine that applies to the American national character. It was when I was first starting to teach English as a foreign language, and I had a class of delightful Asian ladies, and somehow the subject of national character came up, and things about the old world. They, for instance, some of the Chinese ladies absolutely loved when I quoted Will Rogers to them that people who are proud of their ancestors are like potatoes. The best part of them is underground. They love it. Oh yeah, that's like that. That's like China. Everybody always talking about their ancestors, like that. So what defines American national character? I will do a whole presentation on this at some time. in the future. But I said one of the characteristics I've noticed again is meliorism, which is an obscure word related to ameliorate, to make better. Americans tend to believe that all problems have solutions, that we can do a one and done. Okay, we got this one fixed. Now let's fix the next one. And that all situations can be improved, that there's always endless room for improvement. This is, and they all looked very thoughtful, and they'd all lived in America for a while, and then I said, they agreed. Oh, yeah. That's a pretty American thing. And then I agreed. Okay, so what's the first thing you think about it? And they all looked blank at me, And then some of the Asian ladies said that it's not true. No, some problems don't have solutions. You just have to live with them until they fix themselves, or maybe forever. And said, no, not every situation can be improved. I wonder how many engineers. I wonder how many engineers out there could give you examples. I can think of two people have told me about something like the Springfield rifle. They said among bolt-action rifles or something like that, it's pretty much ultimate perfection in design. The only possible improvement is a radical change of design. That applies to engineering. It applies to life. Sometimes you're either as improved as you can possibly be, or more likely, you get to the point where you have improved things, and there's a point of diminishing returns, that further improvements require more and more investment to the point it's just not worth it. It's better that you should just live with the imperfections. All right, then 8. A heterodox theory of history or society is automatically better than an orthodox one. How many examples of this can you think of? Well, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. Despite the fact that they said it was, that they repeated that the President of the Confederacy, the Vice President of the Confederacy, and 5 of the seceding states that actually wrote declarations of secession and the General Declaration of Secession all cite Northern interference in the institution of Negro slavery. But no, it has to be something else, and Abraham Lincoln has to be the most evil president ever. Okay, if you don't like that one, and some of my friends don't, believe me, say the American Revolution wasn't really about freedom, liberty, and independence. It was about a ruling class that didn't like being overruled by the ruling class of England, and they were all a bunch of would-be tyrants. Lordy. The Pearl Harbor was a set-up theory. I think the fact is, on the surface that looks, kind of weird, but you got to kind of suspicious that, in hindsight it seems there were warnings that should have been taken seriously. But the first principle of conspiracy is never attribute to conspiracy that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. In fact, this was looked into. The admiral who got sacked, I think, Admiral King, was it, wrote a book about, I was set up, Yeah. No, actually, I believe it was investigated at the time, but, and, no, there hasn't been a smoking gun found about that. At any rate, all right. Now, nihilism. Around here, up to here, it's kind of amusing. Right here, it gets sinister. Nihilism, the existing state of affairs is so corrupt it must be destroyed so a new one can be created de novo, overnight. The example I used at the time was Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, which happened. I was in Poland, I think, and yes, I remember somebody coming in, one of my students saying, "Oh, teacher, you're from Poland. What about the bombing?" And said, "What? The what?" McVeigh, the people who think, people of this nihilistic bent, nihilistic, very often think that that they can create a trigger point because they observe that there are trigger points in history. Some seemingly trivial sorts of things, which is actually at the end of a long train of abuses, a long train of things, and something something that historians later point to as the triggering incident. And the thing about people like this is they think they can be the triggering incident. They think they can engineer this point. Timothy McVeigh failed to realize something, that while Americans really don't like their bureaucracy, we're often quite fond of our bureaucrats. That means, we see, get this. I was a welfare bureaucrat once for 2 of the most miserable months of my life. And bureaucrats don't like bureaucracy either. We rather like, bureaucrats, are perfectly capable of being nice and polite and decent. There is the phenomenon of the DMV lady and such. And I've seen pretty arrogant bureaucrats in other countries that enjoy pushing you around. But the fact is that's not generally the way it is here. We saw McVeigh was I believe was allegedly looking for revenge for Waco, but Americans realized that Waco was an aberration. Waco and Ruby Ridge. The fact is, the remarkable thing about them is not as much that they happened, is that it happens so seldom, given the nature of governments to get that way when they can. No complex social order can be built de novo overnight. It takes time. And 10, this is where it gets really pathological, and I see an awful lot of this today. That disagreement comes from villainous and self-interested motives. Or in the case of the noble oppressed classes, if you point out that there is a small but growing number of African American conservatives, they say, well, they're agents of white supremacy taking crumbs from the table. One, why would you insult someone so hideously for disagreeing with you? And 2, what does it say about you? If you are going to be attacked that way, what are you justified in thinking? What is the logical correlation of that? What do you think someone who thinks of you would do to you once they get power? Now, the possibility that a reasonably intelligent person who is morally not much worse than oneself has looked at the same reality and reached different conclusions is evidently too uncomfortable to consider. And in this day and age, when frankly friendships are being rent asunder by disagreements, I had wondered, why is that happening? And I believe it to be because some people have constructed this image in their heads of everybody who disagrees with me, everybody who thinks like this is an evil person acting from evil motives, evil self-interested motives. And when they have long-term friends, or God help us, family members who disagree with them, they know that they're not dealing with an evil person. If it were a stranger, they could dismiss him. Oh, that's an evil SOB there. But what the existence of someone they know not to be evil, who they know to be reasonably intelligent, and they know has perhaps been raised in the same circumstances as they were, the same sort of social environment and such like that, who disagree with them, sends them into an absolute towering rage, because cognitive dissonance. They want to believe you are this way. They know that you're not. First they get enraged. The next step is they want to cut off all contact with you. That's where friendships and family relationships get rent, so that they don't have the example of you in front of them, so that they can believe that you're evil. It used to be you could believe they were deluded, but they have a need to believe that you're evil. At any rate, like I say, I wrote that 13 years ago, and it is available on my blog. It is called AEYRheads, AEYRheads, AEYRheads. And you can look at the original there and see if I'm right. I think I am. That yes, it wears pretty well as a model, even after 13 years. Okay, this is Rants and Raves video edition on a very, very chilly morning. There, stay warm, everybody, and let good thoughts warm your soul. Good morning.